What is more tragic than a crown that begins in glory and ends in deformity? In November 1784, the royal palace of El Escorial glowed with hundreds of candles. Courtiers gathered in gilded halls, their voices raised in songs of hope. A child had been born, a boy who would one day inherit the Spanish throne. The Bourbon dynasty whispered promises of strength, of stability, of a prince who might restore the grandeur of Spain. Servants rushed with trays of silver, noblemen raised their cups, and the baby's cradle flickered in the gentle light of wax candles. His name was Ferdinand, and in that moment he was celebrated as the future of a kingdom. But time has a cruel way of rewriting promises. Decades later, the glow of candles returned, but not for celebration. In a chamber heavy with silence, flames trembled against damp stone walls. Their light fell not on a child's cradle, but on the face of a man ravaged by disease and deformity. His jaw hung distorted, his breathing labored, his body swollen and frail. Where once there had been cheers, there was now only the faint rustle of priests and attendants watching a monarch collapse into shadow. His eyes, once filled with expectation, were now hollow mirrors, reflecting nothing but despair. This was Ferdinand VII of Spain, remembered not as a savior, but as a symbol of decay. His reign would see the empire unravel, his body become a grotesque mask of inherited curses, his legacy forever tied to loss. So how could a child once lifted as the hope of a nation die as little more than a broken effigy, a living emblem of a dynasty's downfall? Stay with us as we uncover the story of Ferdinand VII, the most deformed king in history. And if you want to join us on every journey into the shadows of monarchy, make sure to subscribe and watch until the end. The child was carried through the echoing halls of El Escorial, the cold stone brightened by the flicker of candles. Nobles leaned forward to see the infant who might one day sit upon Spain's throne. He was wrapped in silk, crowned already with hope, as priests whispered blessings over the cradle. Yet even in that first ceremony, there were glances quickly exchanged among the servants. The jaw was heavy. The lips did not close easily. A shadow had returned, one that Spain knew too well. Ferdinand was born a Bourbon, yet the blood of the Habsburgs still haunted him. For centuries, that dynasty had turned inward, binding cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, until their line bore the scars of its own ambition. The infamous Habsburg jaw had distorted emperors and kings alike, a grotesque symbol of a family too entangled with itself. Doctors whispered of infertility, of frail constitutions, of children lost before they could grow. That blood had not disappeared. It slept inside Ferdinand, waiting to be seen. From the beginning, he was fragile. His health wavered, his frame softened too easily, and whispers followed him through the corridors of Madrid. Courtiers smiled, but always with a carefulness, as if the promise of a strong heir could not be spoken too loudly. Spain had been promised renewal, yet what they saw in their young prince was a mirror of decline. He was not a prince of promise, but a curse in flesh. Still, appearances had to be guarded. When the time came for portraits, the court summoned the most celebrated artist of their age, Francisco de Goya. Goya sat before the young Ferdinand, brush in hand, eyes searching the face that would one day represent Spain. The jaw was broad and uneven, the lips slightly wet, the eyes dark and uncertain. With careful strokes, Goya softened what reality had made hard. He painted dignity where there was doubt, majesty where there was frailty. To the court, the canvas offered reassurance, Here was no monster, only a solemn prince draped in velvet. But paint could not silence the streets. Beyond the palace walls, Madrid's taverns told another story. Caricatures began to circulate, crude sketches of a prince with jaws stretched into grotesque proportions. He was drawn as an animal, mocked as malformed, passed from hand to hand as a warning of what was to come. The official image was majesty, but the people whispered of a grotesque mask behind the frame. The gulf between the palace and the street widened with every brushstroke, every rumor, every mocking cartoon. The irony was merciless. The dynasty that had once ruled half the world now offered a boy whose very body testified to its exhaustion. Spain had bled itself through wars, drained its treasuries on battles it could not win, and now its heir seemed to carry all that weakness in his flesh. His existence was a symbol Spain could not escape, outwardly wrapped in silk, inwardly undone by centuries of decay. The image of Ferdinand became a contradiction. In the palace, courtiers bowed before the painted prince, the one softened by Goya's hand. In the streets, the people laughed at drawings that stripped him bare, and within the young man himself, both truths collided. He grew knowing that his face betrayed him, that the features he carried were reminders of curses he did not choose. Empires rarely fall with a single blow. They wither in the details, in the quiet betrayals of blood and bone. In Ferdinand, the decline of Spain was already written, even before he spoke his first command. He was meant to be a renewal, yet he embodied exhaustion. He was meant to be a symbol of strength, yet his own portrait needed shadows to conceal its truth. The boy who once lay in a cradle beneath golden light was not the savior Spain hoped for. He was the warning Spain refused to see. And when the day came that he would inherit a throne surrounded by enemies and riddled with doubt, this frailty would become a stage on which all of Spain's tragedies would unfold. When Ferdinand finally inherited the throne, Spain was already trembling under the shadow of Napoleon. French troops had marched across the Pyrenees, their drums echoing through villages that still smelled of smoke. In the chaos, the Spanish people clung to a figure who might embody resistance, someone who could stand against the conqueror who had bent half of Europe to his will. That figure became Ferdinand. Crowds filled the streets of Madrid, their voices rising in chants of Viva Fernando. For once, the prince who had grown up in whispers and mockery was celebrated as a savior. They hailed him not for his body, but for what he represented: defiance against France. Women lifted children to see him, soldiers saluted with tears in their eyes, and bells rang as if Spain itself was being reborn. The image of Ferdinand, frail yet crowned, became a rallying cry. But reality inside the palace was more fragile. While the people shouted his name with fire in their throats, Ferdinand sat in chambers lit with candlelight, his hands trembling as he held decrees. His health was failing even in these early years of rule, his jaw tightening with effort each time he spoke before council. The same man who was called El Deseado, the desired one, often appeared too weak to walk the length of his own corridors without leaning on an attendant. Yet the myth grew. Napoleon himself, calculating and ruthless, saw the potential of this weak king as both a rival and a pawn. At Bayonne in 1808, he forced Ferdinand to abdicate, sending him into captivity in France. In Spanish villages, this humiliation only deepened the legend. They painted him as the innocent victim of imperial greed, a martyr who had suffered for the nation. Guerrilla fighters raised his name as a banner, screaming it as they ambushed French columns in narrow mountain passes. Even within his personal life, The contrast remained sharp. His young wife, Maria Antonia of Naples, walked beside him with a dignity that masked the despair of their childless marriage. She became a symbol of sacrifice, a consort who endured illness and suspicion until her own death in 1806, long before she could see the full unraveling of her husband's reign. To the people, she was remembered as a gentle figure, but within the palace, her absence left Ferdinand even more isolated, a king whose personal life mirrored the emptiness of his rule. The seed of tragedy lay in this contradiction. The people saw in Ferdinand a messiah who would restore Spain's soul, while the man himself was struggling to keep his body from betraying him. In portraits carried through the streets, he looked solemn and unyielding. In the mirror of his private chamber, his eyes betrayed exhaustion and fear. He knew that he was expected to embody defiance, yet every breath felt like a reminder of his own limits. The crown sat heavy on Ferdinand's head, yet the greater weight was not war or politics, but silence. Silence that haunted the royal apartments, where echoes of laughter should have been, where lullabies should have softened the nights. He married 4 times, and each union was proclaimed as the salvation of the dynasty. Yet time after time, hopes dissolved into grief. Maria Antonia of Naples, his first wife, died young, leaving behind no heir. Isabella of Portugal followed, dutiful and devout, but pregnancies ended in tragedy. Maria Josefa Amalia of Saxony, fragile and pious, brought no children. And finally, Maria Cristina of Naples bore him daughters, but not until his last years, when his body was already collapsing. Through most of his reign, the question of succession lingered like a storm cloud over every council meeting. Behind closed doors, ministers whispered, what would become of Spain if the king died without an heir? Who would hold the throne, and which faction would seize power? In smoky chambers lit by oil lamps, nobles drew lines on maps, weighed alliances, and speculated about pretenders. To them, Ferdinand was not only a king, but a fragile vessel of blood, and that vessel was running dry. For the queens themselves, the story was one of quiet torment. Pregnancies that ended in miscarriages were spoken of in hushed tones, as if sorrow could be contained by silence. Courtiers walked carefully around the chambers of mourning, pretending not to notice the tears of queens who had failed to provide what Spain demanded. And Ferdinand, already fearful and suspicious by nature, sank further into solitude. He attended masses, he issued decrees, but within the palace halls, the cradle stayed empty. There is a particular cruelty in royal life. Joy and grief are never private. When a queen's belly swelled, the empire rejoiced, the bells rang, the streets filled with prayers. But when those pregnancies ended in blood and despair, the silence of the palace became deafening. Servants carried away small bundles in the night, and the echoes of what could have been faded into stone corridors. Ferdinand felt this emptiness in his own way. The line of Bourbon kings had been preserved at great cost, yet in his chamber, the future seemed to dissolve with every failed birth. He grew more distrustful of his ministers, more distant from his people, and more dependent on rituals of power that could not hide his isolation. His queens, one after another, became symbols of broken promise. They sat beside him in ceremonies, jeweled and poised, but the absence of an heir made every smile brittle, every celebration incomplete. The Spanish people, once so ready to shout his name as savior, began to wonder if heaven itself had turned against him. A king without sons was a king without legacy, and a throne without legacy was a throne in danger. Whispers spread that God had cursed the dynasty, that the blood of centuries of intermarriage had finally run its course. The weight of the empire rested on a man who could barely produce an heir, and on women who bore more grief than children. In portraits of this period, Ferdinand is often shown with regal attire, heavy fabrics, and solemn gaze. Yet if you look closely, the grandeur of the frame cannot mask the hollowness in his eyes. Behind him, there is no child at play, no future king depicted in miniature. The absence is deliberate, a silence painted into history. And so the palace lived with emptiness. Rooms meant for princes remained unused. Cradles were covered with dust, rocking only when a servant brushed past them. The sound of a baby's cry never echoed through those halls, and the silence became part of Ferdinand's reign. In the palace halls, the cradle stayed empty, and with it the promise of Spain's tomorrow. The loneliness of his private life bled into his public rule. A king without heirs grew increasingly desperate to control his nobles, fearful that his death would unleash chaos. His suspicion hardened into tyranny, his frailty into cruelty. And with every year, the shadow of extinction stretched longer over his crown. Outside the palace walls, Spain was drowning in blood. Villages were burned, soldiers starved. Entire families perished in a war of resistance that swallowed generations. Mothers buried children while chanting his name, as if that name could hold back the tide of empire. Every victory in the hills was declared in his honor, every death offered as a sacrifice to the idea of Ferdinand as savior. Inside, however, the monarch sat surrounded by courtiers who doubted his judgment, who whispered about his fragility, who wondered how long the illusion could be sustained. He issued decrees but often appeared confused, as if the weight of decision pressed down heavier than his crown. The king of flesh was weaker than the king of legend, and the distance between the two widened with every year. What Spain demanded was a figure strong enough to carry centuries of expectation. What it received was a man whose very body seemed to resist the burden. And in that gap between hope and reality, a nation's tragedy was already written. The years weighed on Ferdinand with merciless precision. What had once been whispers about his frailty became impossible to conceal. His body, never strong, grew grotesque. His jaw jutted forward, forcing his lips apart, saliva glistening on his chin during audiences. Courtiers pretended not to notice, bowing as if dignity could be preserved through silence. Yet the truth was undeniable. His breathing was labored, his chest heaved with effort, and his movements grew slower with each passing month. There was a period when his frame swelled, flesh thickened with excess. His figure almost bloated beneath layers of ceremonial silk. But disease carved away even that bulk. What remained was a man diminished, limbs thin, shoulders stooped, a monarch who looked like a shadow of the paintings that still hung on palace walls. Visitors spoke of him as though he were both a king and a ruin, a figure collapsing in real time. This physical decay seeped into his mind. Ferdinand had never been a man of generous temperament, but now suspicion gnawed at him with relentless hunger. He trusted no one. Ministers who once advised him were dismissed at the faintest sign of disagreement. Servants trembled under his gaze, fearful of sudden outbursts. He believed conspiracies surrounded him, that rebellion simmered not only in the streets, but in the very rooms of his palace. The policies of his reign grew harsher. He revoked the liberal constitution that had once promised reforms, preferring instead the absolute rule of an earlier age. Prison doors slammed shut on dissenters, presses were silenced, and whispers of tyranny returned to the taverns of Madrid. It was not only the body that was deformed, but the governance itself, twisted by fear and paranoia. In the evenings, when candles were lit in his private chamber, Ferdinand often sat before a tall mirror. The reflection stared back at him with merciless honesty, the jaw that refused to close, the wetness at the corners of his mouth, the eyes ringed with darkness. He lifted his hand to touch his face, as if to confirm that the grotesque mask was truly his. And in that reflection, he saw not only himself, but the kingdom he ruled, a Spain broken, hollow, stripped of vitality, clinging to a past it could no longer sustain. The mirror became his most faithful enemy. Courtiers could flatter him, portraits could flatter him more, but the glass offered no escape. He would sit in silence, staring at the man who was supposed to be king, and see instead the embodiment of a dynasty's decay. In that silent confrontation, the tragedy of his reign revealed itself. A monarch could command armies, sign decrees, and execute traitors, but he could not escape the reflection of his own weakness. As his body failed, his cruelty deepened. He ordered arrests of men he suspected of plotting rebellion, sometimes without evidence. He crushed uprisings with blood. Convinced that mercy would invite treachery, Spain, already fractured by wars and loss, now bent under the weight of a ruler who governed as though every shadow was a threat. His paranoia became policy, and his infirmity became the fate of millions. Those who served him remembered the smell of medicine in his chambers, the constant presence of doctors, the rattling sound of his breath in the night. He shuffled through his halls as though the palace itself had become a tomb, its windows shuttered, its mirrors veiled when he no longer wished to see himself. But the image of the grotesque king lingered in every memory, a reminder that a ruler's body is never private. It is always political. In Ferdinand's case, the decline of flesh mirrored the decline of Spain. His jaw, his wheezing breath, his trembling hands, all seemed to testify that the throne itself had rotted. He looked into the mirror and saw not only his own reflection, but the crumbling empire staring back at him. And perhaps, in his final years, he realized what history would confirm. His reign had become the portrait of a kingdom in collapse. The end came not with the roar of crowds or the clash of armies, but in a quiet chamber thick with candle smoke. Ferdinand sat alone, a heavy book of prayers resting in his lap. His fingers, once wrapped in jeweled rings, now trembled so violently that the pages shivered with each breath. He tried to raise the book closer to his eyes, but his strength failed him. The weight of the leather binding slipped from his grip, and the sound of it crashing onto the stone floor echoed like a final verdict. He bent forward, as if to retrieve it, yet his body resisted. His chest heaved, his throat rattled. The effort of bending was too much. The prayers he had been reading, words of forgiveness and mercy, now lay scattered on the floor, their silence more powerful than any blessing spoken aloud. The king was left clutching the air, his lips moving without sound. Around him, the palace was still. Attendants lingered beyond the doors, unwilling to intrude, fearful of the scene within. Those who dared to peek found a figure hunched in shadow, lit only by the flicker of wax. His jaw sagged, his mouth wet, his breathing a series of sharp, uneven gasps. No proclamation, no order, no last speech for history's record. only the frail sound of a dying man struggling to remain upright against the pull of the inevitable. The silence grew heavier. Then the rhythm of his breath faltered, once, twice, until the pauses between them stretched too long. His head drooped forward. His eyes glazed as though staring past the walls of the palace into some void only he could see. There was no cry of pain, no dramatic collapse, only the soft surrender of a body too long ravaged, too long clinging to a throne it could not sustain. When the attendants finally entered, they found him still seated, his lifeless hand extended toward the fallen book. The image was chilling in its simplicity. A king who had ruled through suspicion and cruelty, who had been carried on the shoulders of legend and cursed by his own reflection, now sat motionless before a mirror he would never face again. The prayers remained unread, the book left open on the floor as if history itself had written the final page for him. In that chamber, no trumpet sounded, no anthem swelled. The only sound that lingered was the memory of the book striking stone, a noise that seemed to echo through the corridors long after the candles had burned down. The silence that followed was absolute, a silence that did not honor but rather exposed the emptiness of his reign. Outside, Madrid did not erupt in mourning. There were no waves of grief sweeping across the city. The people had grown weary of a king who promised salvation but delivered tyranny. His death was marked, but not celebrated, acknowledged more as the closing of a bitter chapter than the loss of a beloved sovereign. Ferdinand VII passed from life as he had lived much of it, shrouded in frailty, defined by absence, leaving behind questions that outlived him. Who would inherit the throne? What future could Spain claim after so many years wasted under the weight of his deformity and suspicion? In the silence of that night, only one thing was certain. The king who had once been lifted as hope had left the world as a shadow, his legacy sealed by the echo of a falling book. History does not remember Ferdinand VII as a savior. It remembers a king whose body and rule carried the exhaustion of a dynasty that could no longer renew itself. In portraits, his jaw sits heavy and unyielding. His eyes seem distant, and the velvet of ceremony cannot hide the weight of decline. He stands in memory as one of the most deformed monarchs of Europe, not only in flesh, but in the imprint he left on Spain. During his reign, the Spanish Empire in the Americas unraveled. Across the ocean, cities rang with declarations of independence, and new republics stepped out from under the shadow of Madrid. Mexico raised its banner. The Andes became a ladder to freedom, and across the plains and coasts of the continent, royal standards came down. Names that had once filled maps with the color of Spain now belonged to other destinies. In Madrid, courtiers preserved rituals, but the maps on palace walls grew pale as territory after territory slipped away. This is the double image that history keeps: a crown still gleaming in ceremony, a state hollowed by fear and suspicion, a monarch who once inspired prayers for deliverance, a rule that narrowed into censorship and cells. Scholars argue over constitutions and decrees, over the timing of reforms and restorations. Yet beyond those arguments stands a stark symbol. Power that cannot pass life to the next generation, cannot pass hope to the present one. Inside the palace, the symbol took a simple form. In the queen's chamber stood a cradle, polished by expectation, quieted by time. Servants dusted it and moved on. It waited for footsteps that never arrived, for a heartbeat that never filled the night. The throne room glittered for ambassadors, the chapel filled with incense and Latin. Yet the cradle remained the truest sentence on the reign. It spoke of a dynasty that could not breathe new life, of a kingdom that watched its future recede like a shoreline at low tide. So the memory of Ferdinand settles like candle smoke. It clings to tapestries and documents and portraits, and it hangs over a century that began with promise and ended with loss. He is recalled not as the architect of renewal, but as the figure under whom Spain's American empire became a memory. The man and the monarchy mirror each other, both strained, both unable to rise to what history demanded. If a cradle can stay empty while a throne decays, how many other empires have crumbled the same way? Stay with us as we continue to uncover the truths hidden beneath crowns. And if you wish to walk further into the shadows of monarchy, remember to like this story, share it with others, and subscribe. For history's darkest echoes are never far from the world we know.